We often show photographs and videos of ghost sightings caught on CCTV or other devices that seem completely random with no history or explanation as to why they might be there. So in this video, we're going to look at ghosts who are known to haunt locations around the world, but that have heartbreaking backstories that may explain why their spirits linger. Now before we begin, check out our Patreon page, where for just $2 per month, you'll get access to exclusive documentaries that we do not upload to YouTube. We have hours of content on there, and you will not be disappointed. Now, as always, hit those lights, sit back, and enjoy. Lavinia Fisher, Charleston. Lavinia Fisher was born in 1793 in Charleston, South Carolina. She grew up to be a charming woman and went on to marry John Fisher. The couple ran an inn just outside of Charleston known as the 6 Mile House. The inn was popular with traders who stayed there overnight, either on their way to trading goods or on their way back home from business trips. Many of them would be carrying large amounts of cash. The inn was also a favourite refuge for gangsters and highwaymen, and the place became a breeding ground for crime. The Fishers were aware of this and worked with the gangsters to cheat trade guests out of their money during poker games. However, John and Lavinia were greedy, and the paltry amounts being made from poker games was not enough to satisfy them. So they devised another elaborate plan to profit from the fortune of their unsuspecting guests. Lavinia started using her beauty and charm to lure male visitors into staying at the inn, where she would lavish them with attention and good food, all washed down with a cup of her special tea. Tea that was laced with oleander, a toxic shrub that induced sleepiness and even death. Once her guests were either sleeping soundly or dead, John would rob them of their riches. The unfortunate guests that did wake up were stabbed to death, dismembered, and their remains slung in the cellar. It was also rumoured that trapdoors were installed into the floors under the guests' beds, so when guests retired to bed, the door would drop, plunging them to their deaths in the cellar below, allowing John to pillage their cash and valuables. This went on for years, until suspicions were aroused as more and more men disappeared, and locals began to realise the victims had a common factor: their last known whereabouts was at 6 Mile House. In February 1819, a local group gathered and visited the 6 Mile House to inquire about the gang activities that were going on there. When they left, they were satisfied that they had succeeded in eliminating the rough clientele the Fishers were welcoming into their inn. They travelled back to town, leaving one of their members, a man called David Ross, to monitor the situation. The next morning, David became a victim when 2 highwaymen ambushed him. As he was being attacked, he saw a familiar face of Lavinia Fisher and was hopeful she would intervene and rescue him. However, it soon became apparent they were acting on her instruction. Her actions shocked and surprised him, and instead of help he initially expected, Lavinia choked him before smashing a window pane with his head. Luckily, he managed to escape and return to Charleston to share the story of what happened. Just a few hours later, a trader named John Pebbles arrived at the inn looking for a room. Lavinia calmly explained that there was no vacancies, but she invited him in for a break from his travels and offered him tea. Pebbles despised tea, but courteously accepted the cup before discreetly pouring the toxic blend into a plant pot. The Fishers couldn't understand why Pebbles was still awake, so they switched tactics and told him a room had unexpectedly become vacant and invited him to stay. Pebbles accepted the offer but felt uneasy, and his instincts prompted him to sleep in the room's chair that night. As he slept, he was awoken by a loud crash. When he opened his eyes, he could see the bed intended for his night of sleep had disappeared into the floor. He fled quickly through the window, not looking back until he had arrived on horseback in Charleston, where he told law enforcement about the terrifying occurrence. Pebbles provided a detailed statement that showed similarities in the violence that David Ross had experienced. These accounts were enough to prompt law enforcement to arrest Lavinia and John Fisher, as well as their 2 accomplices. The inn was raided by investigators, and the possessions of the disappeared visitors were uncovered, along with Lavinia's sleeping potion, and the trapdoors. It's unclear whether any human remains were found, but some accounts say 2 bodies were discovered, although it's widely believed that all the missing guests had wound up dead. Lavinia and John Fisher protested their innocence, but at trial they were both found guilty on multiple highway robbery charges. At the time, this was a capital offence and punishable by hanging. In January 1820, the court rejected the couple's appeal, and their execution was scheduled for later in the month, to allow the couple time to make peace with God. The Reverend Richard Furman was tasked with saving the couple's souls. John pleaded with the Reverend to help him rid his spirit of evil. Lavinia, however, avoided any effort to redeem herself of her heinous crimes. On February 18, 1820, the couple were led on their final walk to the gallows. John carried his newly found peace and spirituality and asked the Reverend to read a letter he had written to the baying crowd. In it he persisted to say that he was completely innocent of any crime and claimed that he was a victim of the broken judicial system. He also desperately pleaded with the Crown for forgiveness. In contrast, Lavinia refused to go quietly to her death and was desperate for a last-minute pardon. She made quite a show and had to be forcefully carried to the gallows. She also insisted on wearing her wedding dress. Lavinia was dragged shouting and screaming to the gallows, and instead of asking for forgiveness, she blamed the local socialites for her conviction. Her rowdy behaviour made it difficult for the executioners to properly tighten the noose around her neck, and in one final act of defiance, Lavinia leapt from the platform and hung lifelessly over the crowd of onlookers, but not before she shouted her last bold words. "If you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me, I'll carry it." The wicked smile of Lavinia's face as her soul left her body left witnesses traumatized for years to come, and it seems she was not about to let anyone forget her fate, as her restless soul has haunted the old Charleston ever since. Many have reported seeing her unrepentant, anguished face wandering around the area, and her reputation as the first female serial killer in the United States is kept alive in the town of Charleston, with nods and historical relics of her crimes. It's still debated whether she was just a petty thief, or she truly was a woman who killed multiple guests at the 6 Mile House. But whatever the truth is, it seems Lavinia Fisher does not want people to forget her. The Ghost of Julia Legare, Edisto Island. The Presbyterian Church on Edisto Island, South Carolina, is one of the oldest Presbyterian churches in the country, dating back 1685. The main church building that exists today was constructed in 1831, and except for some minor changes, has changed very little in nearly 200 years. The surrounding churchyard contains the graves of islanders dating back to 1787, while the nearby manse dates to around 1790, and the place is of such historical interest that many island natives and genealogists conduct research based on the tombs in the graveyard. All its residents rest peacefully in the well-cared-for grounds. That is except for a woman called Julia Legare, whose soul is forever tortured. Julia was visiting Edisto Island with her husband in the mid-1800s. During the trip she became very unwell, suffering from diphtheria, and fell into a coma. Days passed and she never regained consciousness, and on April 15, 1852, her family doctor declared 22-year-old Julia dead. Her husband and family were understandably distraught, and it was decided that Julia should be laid to rest in her husband's family crypt in the grounds of the Presbyterian Church. As the years passed, the family moved on as best they could, and the crypt remained closed for the next 2 years, until sadly Julia's 4-year-old child also passed away, and the family crypt was again opened to bury the child with his mother. But when the crypt door was opened, it was like something out of a horror film. Pressed closely against the crypt door, there was a female skeleton. There was also evidence of scratches, as someone desperately tried to escape the marble tomb. The realization was that poor Julia had been buried alive. Her family were horrified, and from the day the crypt was opened and her body was discovered, strange hauntings plagued the area, and the door to the crypt would not stay shut. Again and again, cemetery employees would find the mausoleum door open to the point where cemetery employees decided to remove the door in an attempt to appease Julia's final wish, to be set free. Sadly, just 2 years after the child died, Julia's husband also passed away, and he too was buried in the crypt. By now the door was off and the floor sealed up. However, to this day, Julia's restless spirit continues to haunt the area around the crypt and inside the tomb. Those who have been in there report a definite presence, and some have claimed to have seen Julia's spirit roaming the grounds, or have heard scratching noises from within the crypt. Julia and other members of the family are now buried deep below the cement floor, but it's said Julia's spirit lingers on. Crazy Mary's Hole in Pakefield, Suffolk. Pakefield Lighthouse is a decommissioned 19th century lighthouse near Pakefield, Lowestoft in Suffolk. The lighthouse tower has been used for a variety of maritime, civilian and military roles, and today is a coast watch lookout post. In the mid-1800s, the lighthouse was a signal of hope for sailors passing through Pakefield Gateway, the channel between two shifting sandbanks which offered safe passage to Lowestoft Harbour. However, as many of them discovered, the light from the lighthouse also beamed across Crazy Mary's Hole, an area said to be haunted by a distraught ghost of a widow waiting for her husband to come home. Mary is said to have stood on the cliffs, pacing up and down, waiting for her husband, whose boat had failed to return from a fishing trip. Every evening at around 9 p.m, a distraught Mary could be seen looking out at sea in the hope that she would see the sails of her true love's boat approaching the shore, but every night she saw nothing. Eventually she was driven mad by grief and finally joined her beloved husband in the sea by walking into the waves and drowning. Ever since, her spirit has been seen pacing up and down the cliff, wringing her hands in despair. During World War I, a sentry post was set up in the area in case the enemy chose this exposed spot to launch an invasion, and it's said that soldiers refused to guard there alone because they were frightened of the dark shadows they'd seen pacing along the cliff. The stories continued through the next war and up until the early 1980s, when an employee of the nearby Pontins holiday camp spotted a solitary figure of a woman close to the lighthouse. As he approached the figure, she vanished into thin air. Dead Woman's Crossing in Oklahoma. On July 7, 1905, 29-year-old Katie James and her 14-month-old baby, Lula Bella, boarded a train to visit a cousin in Payne County, Oklahoma. She was waved off by her father, Henry. Katie had recently filed for divorce from her husband on the grounds of cruelty and wanted to get away for a while to plan her future. However, her father became concerned after he hadn't heard from his daughter for several weeks, so he hired a private investigator named Mr. Bartle to go out and look for her. After some investigation, Bartle learned that Mrs. James had met and befriended Fanny Norton, a known prostitute, on the train, and that evening Norton had taken Mrs. James and Lula to the home of her brother-in-law William Moore in Clinton. They spent the night there before riding off in a horse-drawn wagon the next morning, saying they would be back in around 3 hours. Norton returned alone 2 hours later. The detective discovered that the wagon had disappeared into a field near Deer Creek, and after about an hour had reappeared at speed with one of its wheels stained with blood. Norton then pulled up at a farmer's house, called the farm boy over, and handed him a baby wrapped in a bloody dress. Clearly, something had happened to Katie, but when the detective tracked down Norton, she denied killing Mrs. James. However, later that day, Fanny Norton swallowed a heavily dosed poison that killed her almost immediately, and it was presumed she couldn't live with the guilt of killing Kate. On August 31st, 1905, the remains of a woman were discovered near Deer Creek by a local fisherman, and it was confirmed that they belonged to Mrs. James. Her estranged husband, Martin James, went on to inherit her estate and disappeared with their daughter, Lula Bella. The mystery was never solved, and a number of questions still remain. it seems Katie is not keen to let it rest, as her spirit still roams the streets and banks near Deer Creek, calling out for her baby daughter. Other stories claim that if you stand beneath the bridge crossing the creek and listen closely, you can hear the rattle of wagon wheels rolling around above you. The original wooden crossing where Katie's body was found is long gone, but a concrete bridge that replaced it was quickly nicknamed Dead Woman's Crossing, after the young woman whose spirit still haunts the place. The Strange Case of Katie Morgan, San Diego. Katie Farmer was born in Fremont County, Iowa in around 1864. Her mother died on September 23, 1865, and at the age of 2, young Katie was sent to live with her maternal grandfather. On December 30, 1885, Katie married Thomas Edwin Morgan, and they had one child, a boy, born October 31, 1886. But sadly the child only lived for 2 days. Eventually Katie's marriage failed, and she ran off with Albert Allen, the stepson of Thomas's stepmother. It appeared this relationship was also doomed. On Thanksgiving Day 1892, Katie turned up at the Hotel Del Coronado in San Diego and checked in under the name Mrs. Lottie A. Bernard. Staff remembered her being alone and sad, and she told them that she was waiting for a gentleman to join her, but after 5 days there was no sign of him. She was later found dead on the external staircase of the hotel that led to the beach. Katie died from what was believed to have been a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. At the time of her death, police could find nothing to positively identify her, so a description of her was telegraphed to police agencies around the country. As a result, newspapers began to refer to Katie as the beautiful stranger. Eventually her identity was revealed and the story of her life unraveled. In the days leading up to her death, Katie had been employed as a domestic in a wealthy Los Angeles household. It was from there that she travelled by train to the hotel, where fellow passengers reported that a woman matching Katie's description had argued with a male companion during the journey and had deserted her en route. It seemed Katie was waiting for her lover at the hotel, and when he never returned, she killed herself. Since her death, her ghost has haunted the hotel, and for years, guests and employees have experienced ghostly goings-on. Most incidents have happened in Katie's third-floor guest room, where visitors have experienced flickering lights, a television that turns itself on and off, breezes coming from nowhere, inexplicable scents and sounds, items moving off on their own accord, doors that randomly open and close, abrupt changes in room temperature, and unexplained footsteps and voices. The story of Katie Morgan intrigues visitors so much that the room in which she stayed in is now the most requested guest room at the hotel. Independent paranormal researchers have also investigated the room and have used high-tech gadgets to document the supernatural activity. There have also been sightings in the hotel hallways and along the seashore. Allegedly, another very active area is the resort's gift shop, where visitors and employees routinely witness giftware mysteriously flying off shelves, oftentimes falling upright and always unbroken. The story of Katie's tragic life has also been documented in a book called The Beautiful Stranger, and is the official account of Katie's visit to the hotel, and also contains newspaper reports of her death, as well as the coroner's inquest notes. So it seems that although Katie was deserted in life, she has made up for it in death. So that's 5 tragic backstories behind 5 incredibly haunted locations. We hope you've enjoyed this video, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.